So I want to talk about Leibniz and his mill. Um, I'll just ask you, do you think it's an early version of the explanatory gap argument about consciousness?
Well, so if the listeners don't know, Leibniz in his great work, The Monadology, he talks about um, what it would look like if you went if you to explain what he calls perception um, in mechanistic terms. It would be like going inside a mill and looking for the activity of the mill by looking at all the individual pieces and trying to figure out what the mill was actually doing by just looking at the tiny parts inside. And he said you'd get no understanding of it from that. So people have thought that this is an early version of what's called the explanatory gap, that you can't explain mental things in terms of physical things. You can't explain consciousness in particular in terms of the brain.
Hmm.
Um, Now, there is a connection there with Leibniz, but I don't think it's quite right to think of this as an early version. And I really appreciate your comments about what I'm trying to do, because um, what we have to try and do when we're looking at philosophers of the past is try and see why things were questions for them. Because if we don't see why it's a question for them, then we can just see it as a version of a question for us. But we have our own questions, which have grown up through the tradition,
Yeah.
in this very long conversation that have become in our tradition, and other traditions have other questions. And I think if you look back into earlier parts of the tradition, and you always assume that those questions are basically the same as our questions, like the question of the explanatory gap. Is there a gap between the explanation of between consciousness and the brain? If you assume these are always versions of our questions, then you're going to get a very distorted view of the history of philosophy. You're not going to understand how philosophy develops in this dynamic way. Philosophy is a conversation, and it's not as if there are the same questions set from eternity in what David Armstrong used to call the philosophical examination paper. As if at the beginning of philosophy, a bunch of questions were set, and we've been trying to answer those questions for the last thousands of years. So I think in the case of Leibniz, what's interesting is if you want to say this is an argument, a version of the explanatory gap, then you'd expect him to be talking about materialism, and you'd expect him to be talking about consciousness as an objection to materialism. This is the way people use the phenomenon of consciousness. They say, look at the brain, look at how it works. You can't explain how consciousness can emerge from that. That's the explanatory gap.
Yeah.
But he doesn't actually talk about materialism in the whole of that work, the monadology. He talks about it elsewhere in lots of places, and he's very opposed to materialism. And he thought that, well, he had a very complex and obscure metaphysical worldview,
Yeah.
which I don't think we need to go into too much detail here. But
Sure.
so he wasn't really talking about materialism. He was talking about something else. He was talking about whether you could explain consciousness mechanistically.
Yeah.
What mechanistically means in terms of the relationships between a thing and its parts. That was the point of the analogy with the mill. You look inside the mill and you look for how all the parts are hooking together, and you won't find, the main activity of the mill. But he wasn't even talking about consciousness either, because he was talking about what he called perception. And perception for him could be unconscious. So the point of this argument was not that materialism could not explain consciousness, but it was rather that you can't give a mechanistic explanation of perception. The perception must come from something which is a simple thing without parts, because if it was a thing with parts, then you could explain it in terms of its parts. And these simple things that he said were without parts were what he called monads, or substances. And he said that perception must be a capacity of a monad, or a simple substance.
Yeah.
So this is a very different kind of view from the view that materialism can't explain consciousness. He wasn't interested in that question at that point. He was interested in the question of whether perception could be a capacity of complex things
Yeah.
and he wanted to argue it couldn't. It had to be a capacity of monads or these simple substances.
Yeah.
Mm.
That's so fascinating. It's so helpful. It makes sense as I'm thinking of Leibniz and, the way you're just, going over the exegesis of that. Um, d are do you remember, do you recall, are we substances for Leibniz? Like, am I, I'm sorry, am I a monad? Am I a monad? Because I thought monads were like these
Mm.
the little BBs of reality.
Yeah, yeah. Um, it's actually a very difficult question, and Leibniz scholarship
Yeah,
is a pretty frightening thing when you
I'm
get
su
into it. And
yeah.
because Leibniz was an incredibly brilliant thinker, and he
Mm,
thought so quickly. You could see that he often leaves out the steps in between his arguments because he
mm,
thinks he's carrying his reader with him, but he doesn't explain everything. The way I understand Leibniz is that we are among the monads of the world, our souls,
okay.
because, and I think Leibniz should be thought of as a kind of idealist. So an idealist who thinks that the ultimate realities, the substances, are something like minds or souls.
Okay.
Um, but there are also other. We're not the only monads, so there may be other things which are monads too.
Okay.
But all those things perceive, and they perceive, um, and they initiate a kind of activity. They have a kind of impetus, um, but they're mental things.
Yeah.
Uh, it, it, and the world we see around us is a kind of appearance. It's a kind of appearance which is based on the coordination of all our what he calls perceptions, um, which we can think of as just mental representations
Yeah.
of the monads. The
Yeah.
monads all kind of somehow coordinate their perceptions in what Leibniz called a pre-established harmony.
Mm,
So it happens that when you see the tree outside the window and I see the tree outside the window. That's really that's what that's or what that is underneath is the fact that our perceptions are coordinating with one another,
yeah.
um, and ultimately that was set up by God.
Yeah. Or the simulator. I've read part of your piece on the new book, Reality Plus, by David
Yeah,
Chalmers, and another fascinating one. I love, you're kind of putting his feet to the fire on idealism there, which was fantastic. So, it makes sense that we would be monads because otherwise his people have characterized the Mill argument as the unity of consciousness argument or a unity of phenomenal consciousness, and if we were not a monad, but built up out of monads, then we have parts, and his whole argument kind of falls apart because we're not supposed to have parts, right?
that's right. We can't. That's the fundamental starting point is that there must be simple substances, and he gets to the view that the soul must be that souls, individual souls, like the he thinks we have, are simple,
Yeah.
and then not built up out of parts. That's right.
Okay.